I'm going to warn you in advance. This is a very opinionated panel. They're awesome. We had a call last week, and it probably could have gone on for an hour. So you are definitely going to hear opinions. And the subject is storytelling in the digital age. And I think we all believe there's some room for improvement there. So I would like each of you to introduce yourselves, your role, and we'll take it from there. Go ahead, Axel. Oh, you have it.
Oh, thank you. Hi, my name is Axel Adida. I'm Chief Operations Officer with L'Oreal globally, and I oversee the transformation of advertising for digital.
Good morning, I'm Steve Clayton, the Chief Storyteller for Microsoft, which not quite sure what that means these days, but we'll find out. But yesterday on BBC's Radio 2, it was called a pointless job, so apparently I now have a pointless job according to the BBC.
It's very exciting. Congrats.
I'm so proud.
I'm Ben Lehrer, founder of Group 9. We are a collection of media brands trying to sort of rebuild last generation's cable holding company in a post-cable world. And so we own 4 brands that are category leaders in different sort of genres of consumer interest. One called Now This, one called The Dodo, one called Thrillist, and one called Seeker. And collectively, we're one of the sort of larger digital players now in the world as far as engagement and just audience reach and social.
Just to add a little bit more dimension to our panel, I pulled off a couple things from the internet about them, which I thought I would share. Axel, look at he's getting all fidgety now. Received my first search engine training at 8. Fell in love with Apple II Europlus at 10. Great passion for Mac 128. 15 years consulting at Accenture. But the start of the bug, I got lured in to join L'Oreal's digital acceleration and to change beauty forever. And your quote is, I enjoy and thrive building businesses, brands, and teams with a constant devotion to style from visual arts to web experience design. Obviously, beauty is a match. Very nice. And Ben, you nervous?
Terrified, yes.
Founder of Thrillist, CEO of Group 9 Media. Podcast on Business Insider, how I got from decently spoiled kid to digital media mogul and what drives you to be ambitious. So if anybody wants to read that or hear that podcast, you can.
Please do not.
No. Steve Clayton, helping shape the company's image, telling its culture story, and sharing its strategy internally and externally through compelling storytelling. CTO of Microsoft's partner group, systems engineer, fan of Liverpool Football Club, enjoys art, design, and snowboarding. Excellent. So, gents, I'm going to kick it off with a question for all of you. What is your view on storytelling today? What do we need to do more of and less of? And provide any examples, good or bad.
I'm happy to start. I think one thing I do think we need to do is sort of respect the phrase storytelling. A quick story on that. When I got this job, I moved to Seattle 8 years ago, having previously worked at Microsoft in the UK for about 13 years. And when I joined, my job was to be a sort of spokesperson for the company and to talk about innovation. And I was just talking to Ben and saying, 8 years ago, we weren't really known for innovation. We didn't do a ton of innovation. So it was kind of it was a funny job to do because there wasn't a ton of great stories to tell. But I remember the first time I was asked to go and speak to the media, and our media agency at the time said, hey, what job title should we give you? What should we tell the press that you are? And I said, just tell them I'm a blogger, because at the time I was just blogging about the company. And they said, well, everybody's a blogger. They said, why don't we call you a chief storyteller? And I said, well, that sounds good. So they called me a chief storyteller. And then about 6 weeks after that, Fortune magazine phoned up and they said, hey, we heard that you have somebody at the company called the chief storyteller, and we're really interested in doing profile on people with interesting job titles. So I did an interview with Fortune magazine, and then a week later they published this piece, and it didn't say people with interesting job titles, it said people with wacky job titles. It wasn't particularly complimentary. But back then, I think I was one of the only people that was called a chief storyteller, and now there are lots of them, to the point where I think we're now overusing the word storytelling. That we take any piece of content and we call it storytelling, and I'm a bit more of a purist. That as I think of the team that we've built to go and do storytelling, we've recruited people from who have a video background. We've recruited a lot of people who have a journalistic background, who truly, I think, know what storytelling is. Like, when you talk to them, they say a story has an arc and it has characters and it has heroes, and it's a very classical Hollywood view of storytelling. And I don't think we need to be that pure, but I also think that the word or the phrase and the discipline of storytelling has got quite diluted over the last few years.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with that. I think what's interesting and what we think a lot about is sort of, again, this sort of transition from sort of storytelling in a cable TV world into digital. And I think what has happened for the most part in the sort of this first generation of digital video storytelling is actually not a whole lot of really good storytelling. So most content creation sort of built for digital has been very disposable, has been about sort of feeding the beast of the feed, and sort of playing the algorithm. And you've seen obviously sort of just like a backlash against this. You're seeing a lot of research that suggests that people are very unhappy consuming a lot of this sort of digital storytelling, and that the sort of addiction to these platforms is like wildly unhealthy. And I think and then you see them trying to combat it with creating with trying to sort of sift the bad stuff out of the platform and really focus on creating content that's about time well spent, as I think is Mark Zuckerberg's term. But there's this really interesting and exciting opportunity that exists right now to and a lot of this has to do with the pipes changing, and now sort of creating. So a few years ago, the only format that existed was this, like, again, this disposable short form video format that existed online, and then there was sort of like the dying medium of like whatever cable TV is, and I think what's really interesting now is you're seeing these new formats emerge with like a stories format that is now what Snapchat and now Instagram stories and now Facebook is creating. You're seeing with Facebook Watch emerging, and with YouTube and with Snap, a place for more episodic, like new mid-form storytelling. And so I think what's interesting is just the palette is changing, and there's opportunities now to tell different kinds of stories in digital beyond just the idea that everything is sort of quick and disposable. And so it's a really exciting time. But and I know on the call we talked a lot about sort of the difference between how you use data to inform storytelling and like what that blend of art and science is. And I think we're in the very early innings now of figuring out sort of what this next generation of storytelling will be.
Yeah, we'll come back to that. We'll also come back to the difference between editorial-based storytelling and brand storytelling too. But Axel?
Maybe on my end. So I'm a beauty advertiser. So we have brands like Saint Laurent. Anybody wear Saint Laurent? Yeah, a little bit. Lancôme. Okay. L'Oréal Paris. Okay, so we have a bunch of brands. And recently I had a few guys and we had a chat, and something came back to my mind, which is the prediction from a fantastic guy, one of the first inventors of rap, called Gil Scott-Heron. Probably rings a bell to a few. And he had a fantastic song that went, "The revolution will not be televised." He had no clue that it was talking about Facebook and not about social revolution. But the truth is, the one thing that has been changing for us as an advertiser in the past years is that your relationship to cognition has changed a lot. So if you think about it, you go back to Gutenberg. At the time where the guy invents the press, a book is a unit of knowledge which is 500 pages long. And you can have plenty of fancy stories in the Bible which are really interesting. When you move on to the 19th century and you get to Fleet Street and the press, and you have like 4 or 5 sheets of paper in which inside you're going to have signs between 200 to 20,000 max. And so your entry in stories into news is something which is pretty long, with a beginning, a middle, and an end. And at the moment where we get into the Facebook, Instagram years, essentially your window in the world is a small device, which is 6 to 8 inches max. And your window in the world is essentially a stamp with an image and tops, 6 or 7 words. And the massive change, I think, from my window, is that people on window in the world has changed so much that we need to adjust to a world where brevity is the norm. And people may want actually to get somewhere afterwards to dig into the story and to know more, but it's a world of mostly of headlines and with a few images which are dragging you somewhere. And I think the guy who actually pointed it nicely was Shakespeare, saying that brevity is the soul of wit. So from a storytelling standpoint, there's a lot more of a 6 words book by Hemingway that there is from Andrei Tarkovsky very long movies. How do you make sure that you're being compelling in telling a story in just one image? How do you want people to get further and then drag along? So it really changes the entry point from my end.
Yeah. I didn't want to steal your thunder, but we were going to rename this discussion from Gutenberg to Zuckerberg. Remember that? But fantastic. So what role does emotion play or should play in storytelling? It's kind of a silly question, actually, because it should play a role, right? But just talk a little bit about that in the digital age, and where are we with that, and what should we be doing, again, more or less of in regard to emotional storytelling and evoking emotion and being engaging. And how can brands do that? Should they be doing that, and how can they do that better?
I think they should. We were talking about it just before we stepped up here, Ben and I, and saying, we've got, for lots of us, the consumers that we're now trying to reach, they're a different consumer, whether it's millennials or Gen Zs, but there's real focus around, at least for us, how do we make this shift to talking more about the purpose of the company rather than our products. And we've historically been a product marketing focused company. And 4 years ago, a little over 4 years ago, we got a new CEO. We changed the mission of the company. We've stuck with that mission statement for the last 4 years, which is kind of unheard of for the company because we actually believe in it. And it sort of refound the soul of the company and given us permission to go and do a lot more emotional storytelling. So we talk
for those. Sorry about the umbrella.
Decapitated
For those, exactly. For those who don't know, maybe you all do, but just what is that mission statement? I think it's a really terrific story, and it's a good example of a company institutionalizing what it believes in and having a rallying cry.
The mission statement is to empower every person and every organization on the planet to achieve more. And our CEO has, like I say, historically we've sort of tried on a different jacket every year and said we're going to change the mission statement or we're going to have a different focus prior to the current CEO. And I think that's because we lost our way a little, frankly. Now we've stuck with this mission statement, and our CEO is shamelessly relentless about every time he presents, whether it's internally or externally, he'll talk about the mission statement and tie everything we do back to this mission statement, which ultimately is all around a purpose-driven company that is about helping other people achieve things rather than us trying to achieve our outcomes. Clearly, we're a commercial organization and we want to make money. But there's been a realization of, our place on the planet is to go and help other people. And in doing so, that will help our company. And so through that, just to touch a little bit on the photography side of things, we've invested a ton in photographic storytelling and imagery to tell emotional stories, because we are in this world where, the old adage of a picture's worth 1,000 words. I think it's worth 1,000,000 words these days if you get the right image. And so we've invested an awful lot in photographic-based storytelling over the last 3 or 4 years.
Anybody else want to add to that?
Yeah. I mean, you can't really be in beauty and not being, into emotions. But the one thing, I think there's a massive change, and the form factor is important. So maybe we have in the room fans of Andrei Tarkovsky. No. The guy's a fantastic, Russian storyteller from the 60s, 70s. The greatest movie, Stoker, The Sacrifice. And you recognize the guys immediately because it's long scenes, very slow, moving very quickly, very emotional. Gets to your emotions a lot more if you like Russian movies. They're extremely slow. The one thing, when we change into brevity, we have an audience which is more cleft. So maybe some of you own a Daniel Wellington, or then sons and daughters want one. It's very funny because it's a brand that's been discovered on the internet. And it comes out essentially with a watch which is nicely presented. And people like Casper is very much the same. The straightforward selling propositions is very utilitarian, very bland to a degree, and very explicit. And on the other side, where everything that goes with photography, with imagery, goes straight into your brains. But in a way which is very different from the cinema goes to TV. It's more Terminator and Taken 3 get into your Facebook. So it's something which is short, which is colorful, that pops to your eyes. And the very notion of what emotion means is different when you change the device. So when you go mobile, it's very different. When your eyes have been shaped by Spider-Man, and that you see Rocky again. You think that Rocky is not an action movie. It's an emotional movie, very, very slow. And your emotions, I think the big adjustment in storytelling is moving to the emotions that resonate on a very new device.
It's funny, our executive creative director is up here in the front, and we haven't talked about this, but one of the themes that emerged for me this week is just the shift in the craft. You know, given the tools and the platforms that we're consuming, and you've touched on that in a big way, we haven't really talked enough about the change in the craft of commercial storytelling. I think that's a topic to take on. Ben, talk a little bit about, in your world, the difference, what you see as the differences or not between editorial-led storytelling and brand storytelling, because that's a big one.
Yeah, it's a really big one. And you know, our largest stream of revenue is working with brands to help them create emotional, sort of evocative storytelling for these new platforms. And the best examples of when we're working with brands are we sometimes have opportunities to partner with a brand where the partnership actually lets us create something that we otherwise wouldn't have been able to make. We wouldn't have been able to afford to make. We wouldn't have been able to sort of have the ambition to go and create. That's the best and sort of the holy grail of when we get to work with a brand where we actually have a meeting of the mind and get to go create something together. A really good example of that is something that right now we're doing. I mentioned this to you before. A partnership that we've created with Grey Goose, where they came to. We sort of collectively had this idea to create a new kind of talk show. And what we were able to do is, because we had the sort of benefit of a brand who was able to support the project, we were able to lean in harder than we would have been, and we created this really fantastic talk show starring Jamie Foxx. That's a show that lives on Facebook and on YouTube. And what's been really cool about it actually is all the research that we're getting back is it's not only really sort of helping Grey Goose and helping us grow our audience organically, it's actually really helping Jamie. People are the research that's coming back is that he's tapping into new audiences because he's built his entire career on one kind of screen, and so it's been really fun to see to co-create something, to build IP together, and it's a cool program because it's something where it's not one and done. We're not doing a bunch of work, but it's a show that we'll bring back for multiple seasons. It's a piece of IP that we'll collectively build together and bring to new platforms and bring to new places. And I think it feels like real partnership. That's the best kind of work that we can do. But that, one of the challenges is just the ecosystem right now around sort of the role of agencies and where they sit vis-a-vis brands. And one of the other challenges is it's just hyper competitive right now. Every brand, whether you're the biggest company in the world or whether you're a startup, feels like you have less time in the day, more competition. And so what we constantly get into is this race to figure out ROI on content spend. And that, I think, it's obviously incredibly important, but that touches on this idea of sort of where the art and science intersect. What you find is short-term thinking, short-term budgets, short-term planning often rules the day, and it's rare that we get to go think about building something great and long-term that's going to, over an extended period of time, sort of develop into something really meaningful. And that's why we really value getting to work directly with brands and with chief storytellers and people like that, because that's when you sometimes get to step out of the product marketing. What's the thing we have to go sell today? What's the sort of attribution model for making sure that we're driving to retail on this explicit asset? So that's the longest answer to your question ever. But the other side I would just say is the fun part of trying to work with brands now is I think there's a shift, which is everyone is acknowledging that they don't know what the hell's going on. And so more and more we're getting to we're moving past the point where brands are being incredibly prescriptive and where I think everyone is becoming more open-minded to collaborate.
Did you want to add something? No. You know, that's a good. Oh,
one
go
thing
ahead.
I would just add is I think one of the challenges for us, you know, if I think about a partnership Ben and I could have, is how do we measure the impact on something like Chacho these guys are doing? How do you measure the impact that that has on the brand versus the product? It's like, you know, do Grey Goose care about, are they selling, you know, 10,000 more cases? Probably not, is my guess. But getting some more sophistication, I think, between the different players around how, for us, the things I want to go and do are all about accruing to the brand, which is a little bit of a shift because we've previously been more focused around the product. And I don't have the sophistication yet. I mean, I would love to get help with it around how do you do this type of work and then be able to go back to, you know, my paymasters and say, here's how this is accruing to brand Microsoft versus product X, Y, or Z.
I was just going to. Oh.
Yeah, you know, I think there's a balance in the beauty space and generally in the FMCG space. What's interesting with the new brands is that they demonstrate and constantly re-demonstrate that people get really excited about innovation, and that you need to get the novelty across, and they need to show why it's new, why it's interesting, why it's compelling, and all individually we experience that in the way we buy new stuff. But on the other side, the way you pitch your story can't be only about the product. It's also about the system of values, what you stand for, and more generally, not only the cause you defend, or, you know, the way you place women in society, which is something very, very dear to our brands, but it's also about the style and the way you imagine culture and pop culture in the world. Because to an extent, you know, there's an expectation that brand not only reflect the world, but also come with a vision that people find compelling and attractive. And that's also one of your contribution and entertainment.
You know, it's a segue into what was going to be my next question, the devil's advocate question. How do we balance the need for short-term sales? And there's more pressure than ever on most companies, especially any what I call 20th century companies that weren't born digital and can't be as nimble often and don't have all the data and so forth. How do you balance that pressure with doing all the things that you guys are talking about, which is wonderful storytelling that builds the brand as well? What have you seen in your organizations? What are you guys doing? What advice do you have for marketers on that front?
Well, I mean, this is the big question, right? This comes back to how do you what role does content play, and what role does how do you think about your business in the context of today versus tomorrow? I actually, you know, you mentioned Casper before. And another brand that comes to mind is Glossier, which I'm sure you guys look very closely at. These are, I'm investors in both of those businesses. Actually, I'm on the board of Casper, and so I live that experience and how they're building the brand. What's really interesting is there is the challenge that big brands have is they look at these small brands and how nimble they get to be and how they get to be built sort of from the ground up, living natively on these platforms. What's interesting though is I see with all these brands, they reach a point earlier and earlier in their life cycle now where actually they're built on a sort of a very like they're too built for social actually, and they become incredibly reliant on, like, you know, that you built to $200-300 million of sales all on incredibly bottom funnel focused marketing on Facebook. Facebook and Google is where 100% of marketing dollars go. The company grows to $200 million of sales and hits a wall, like smashes into a wall, and then realizes, oh shit, we now need to go and figure out what is our retail strategy or our wholesale strategy, building direct to consumer. Actually, it's amazing, and we have all this rich data, but it's still, most people actually are still buying sort of through other means than going to one person's website and purchasing directly there. What's the role that Amazon is supposed to play in our ecosystem? And then from a marketing perspective, how do we think about our marketing spend changing now that we have to go do that brand work? We have to figure out new formats of storytelling. And so I actually think it works both ways in a very, very, very interesting way. The grass is always greener. So if you're big, you want to be able to be nimble and small. If you're small, you wish that you had some of that infrastructure around how to be big.
One little stat I heard last night before you say something is from a big brand, the likes of probably your brand, Axel, or Microsoft as well, that you've heard of, a global brand, and they said that they lost 30% of their brand equity in the last 2 years And this gets to this point of long-term versus short-term. But the difference is the ways in which we're building brand equity are some of the types of storytelling and experiences that brands can create for consumers. And we've kind of forgotten about that a bit. Sorry.
Oh. You know, what really resonates with me in what you say is, oh, by the way, let's be clear. I don't want to be a small brand. I'm very happy to have big ones, you know, and that's really nice. But many of them were born small, and definitely you need to master the whole palette of the different marketing strings to really play the whole song, and that's where you really come to brand building. I think the core way I look at it, the real change is how do we make sure that our teams have the maneuverability together with the agency to master the new challenges. And like, for instance, you know, to a degree, we get into brevity, longer format. You know, first you hook people on short, you know, because you have 2 seconds to state your pitch, 6 seconds to make the whole story. And then if people are interested, they want to dive into who you are, what your values are, what you stand for. Are you sold on Amazon or at Walmart or something? And people do actually do that. They really search a lot around it. And then what do you do when a new media comes in? Because we were adjusting very much for mobile, which we've done quite a work doing it. And now you got voice and AR and augmented reality. You know, the best way to hide a dead body a few years ago was the second page of Google search results. But now it's probably the second results that Alexa tells you, because you're just going to listen to one thing. So how do you stand out in a context that's going to change technologically in a couple of years?
That's exactly right. You mentioned two things that were the next set of questions. Technology. Let's talk a bit about the role you guys see technology playing in this storytelling that we're talking about.
For a technology company, I have a somewhat contrarian view of the role of technology.
Figured as
that
much.
I think I get somewhat frustrated when people who come to me with, hey, let's go and tell a story, and the answer starts with, let's tell it through VR, or let's tell it through AR, or let's do a podcast, and you know, insert piece of technology. And again, it sort of goes back maybe to my purest view of storytelling is let's figure out who we're trying to tell a story to, and what is the best mechanism or tool to tell that story. We're in this world where, you know, we all know our attention is under attack. And my personal philosophy is a lot of the time when a lot of people are going one way, and so I was just talking to Ben about, you know, the sort of the re-emergence of the podcast format. And whilst I love podcasts, I'm not totally convinced that people wake up in the morning and say, hey, you know what I want to listen to on my way to work is a podcast from Microsoft. I would love them to say that, but I'm not quite sure they do. But we have some great content in a podcast. So then I'm trying to think through, well, what is the right vehicle to, you know, take that content and deliver it? And it might be through partnering with folks like Ben. It might be through, you know, other partnerships that we're taking a look at. But I also have this sort of visceral reaction to, while everybody's going in one direction, you know, my instinct is a little bit to tack in the opposite direction. And so I was saying to Ben earlier, I have this passion to take the podcast content we have and put it onto a vinyl record, which is a much narrower distribution mechanism, but I have this instinct that somehow it will capture people's attention by saying, well, that's not what everybody else is doing, so why are they doing this different thing? And, you know, we might sell 200 copies of the vinyl record, but I kind of don't care. I want to go and explore different routes, because there is this instinct around, if you follow the herd, you're going to get lost in the herd.
Yeah, there's the micro tribes thing, and that would find an audience for sure. Axel, did you want to say something about technology?
Yep.
He wants to buy the record, I can tell.
Oh, well, I first need to buy again a record player. I used to have that a few years ago. And I very much approve of what you say on podcast. Even my children don't listen to me, so I'm always thrilled if people, you know, listening to what I say. But more generally, I think the thing with technology is we don't have a choice where people spend their time. And, you know, this year it's a mega shift in the US, because it's the first year people spend more time digitally than on classic media, TV and print. And they spend more time on their mobile than they do actually on their computer. And the moment where I do that, we are being dictated the form factor with which we interact with people. Augmented reality, it's a bit funny. It's like mobile telephony a few years ago. They hit Europe a bit later than they hit the East. And if you're in the East, like using May to pick or enhancing who you are has been in for a few years. And people, they have all those emojis and stuff and funky stuff to beautify yourself in a way which is very different. And they wouldn't even dare to show anything on social media if it is not playful. So if people move into a thing which is playful, that's one of the reasons we believe AR is a big deal. We acquired this year our first tech company, Modi Face, which is actually an AR company that beautifies you through makeup, through your hair, to style your hair. And it's one of the things people get really interesting about. It's another way to get into beauty, to get into looks. And when people decide to do that, it's a massive change. I think it's very much the same thing through voice. Maybe right now, a few of us believe it's impractical. I myself do find it impractical. But in Asia, it's picked up to a degree where a lot of the search queries are now voice dictated. And tomorrow, probably your mirror is going to talk to you, your fridge is going to talk to you, and then you'd better have something to be good in the story with the right voice, tone of voice, and presentation to that. But I think it's a whole field open for innovation, and we should have a lot of work on this one.
Right. It's funny, the technology, the more it enables us to interact in a way that feels more human, the better it is. It's just thus the iPhone, the touch. Oh, touch versus little keypads and voice, which is and imagery. It's just so funny. It's like the reversal.
Can I just jump in for one quick second on that
Yeah,
question?
yeah, for sure.
I think the thing not to lose in all of this is just making sure that while you want to go chase down new technologies and sort of try new things, which has to be done, I think the key though is to make sure you always get back to sort of that idea of purpose. That's where sort of like the data and the tech piece is valuable, but if you let that dictate every decision you make, you end up not actually mattering. So, just you lean in, but I think you just stay why are we doing this? What's our brand about? What's our role in the world? I think that, the mission statement thing you said is incredibly important, and it's going to be that's a prerequisite to succeed regardless of whatever technology exists.
I couldn't agree more. There's this statement that our CEO used recently, and some of it born out of some of the concerns around social media and around AI technology in particular. And the phrase he used is, which is, again, somewhat ironic coming from a technology company, but I admire it from him, is he says, it's not what can we do with technology, it's what should we do. And I really believe in that, is we can go and, we can tinker away with all this technology, but really what should we be doing with it?
What do you guys think about the GDPR, the data issue as it relates to storytelling? I wasn't planning on asking you guys that question, but I'm curious now just because I'm sort of annoyed by the whole conversation in a way, because my view is I think that it constraints force creativity and innovation. I think we're going to have to do workarounds a little bit, and there's going to be some interesting unintended consequences of that, good and bad. But I'm just curious your views.
There's one thing to acknowledge. Everybody's who's gotten into the advertising space in digital has made baby steps, and en route, a few of the things have not played out nicely. But there's one thing that we need to be absolutely considerate as a brand. People do entrust us to act responsibly. And there's one thing, the core of it is not the law. The core of it is ethics. And in any country, nobody wants you to mess around in a creepy way with what, is personal. And no place, in no industry. And I think the one way to work around it is, people entrust us with a few things, and entrust our platforms with a few things. We need to use it in a way your mother is not ashamed of you if she was seeing what you're doing. And that you're doing it in a responsibility, mom and pop's kind of way. That it's not only decent, legal and lawful, but that you have the consumer at heart in the way you responsibly convey something across. And there's many use cases where it does make a lot of sense. So when I was a kid, I was brought up with TV, and one of the TV ads you saw all the time was about dental fixtures. God, I was 5. Nobody buys dental fixtures at 5s. It doesn't work. So probably, people, when they got digital, the first thing they started saying is, and 3/4 of the people say that, is what we receive, the offers, is not compelling, it's not adjusted to us, it doesn't work. Like in the press for a long time, when data wasn't used, you would see the same ad digitally over and over again, all the same. It's worse for the consumer, it's painful, and it's not relevant for us as an advertiser. Same, and people say, well, I bought something, I bought my trip to Istanbul, and Istanbul keeps coming back like for 3 months. I'm not going to come back tomorrow. And everybody's been experiencing that. So every time we can take the friction and the pain in a way which is relevant and which is extremely clear for the consumer, it's fine, and it's in the good sense. And every time we move in a way where if it was happening to you, say, well, it's sort of creepy, don't even go there.
That is a beautiful answer. We are going to capture that, and we're going to socialize that. Seriously, a lot of people should hear that. That's a beautiful answer. Anybody else? Thoughts?
We're pretty clear on it. We believe that privacy is a human right, and GDPR is a good step in that direction. And I believe if that makes us have to work harder as storytellers, I don't subscribe to the notion that we have to work around GDPR. I think we have to work with GDPR. And I applaud it, honestly. Like, if it makes us have to work harder to get our stories to the audience we want, then good for them, good for us.
Yeah, and I meant work around in that way, not the, Ben?
No, totally agree. I mean, I think that's like the general storyline from everyone who's trying to not totally take advantage of the consumer.
Yeah,
like,
exactly.
GDPR is not a bad thing.
Exactly. Where do you go for today? You mentioned agencies in your speeches. Where do you go today for storytelling, and how has it changed in the last couple of years? Probably pretty profoundly, I'm guessing. But talk a little bit about that, and any tips or advice or best practices that you would share with other marketers and other folks in the industry.
For me, I would say I cast a fairly wide net of whether it's events I attend, and there's a couple of great ones I go to every year in New York. The Future of Storytelling event is a great one, run by some friends from Melcher Media. And I tried to sort of get outside the bubble a bit, to the extent that I actually created a program for my team in Seattle this year that was, our zip code in Redmond is 98052, and we created a program that was called Outside 98052. And it's a little bit the philosophy of the company, as Microsoft has gone through this period over the last 4 years of going from what we have previously, or what we've identified as previously being a know-it-all culture, where it's like, hey, all of the answers surely exist inside of our zip code, to being this learn-it-all culture where we realize that actually they really don't, and we've got to get outside the office. But we put in place mechanisms to, for me at least, to almost force people to get outside the office. And so I give everyone on my team a budget to say, you can go to pick a conference per year, and we will make sure that and this is for the most junior and senior people in the group, about 30 people, and actively encourage them to get outside the bubble of Redmond. And whether it's a conference they go to, whether it's content that I subscribe to, both physical and digital, that we share. But really, I guess for me personally, it's about trying to take in as wide a variety of mediums as possible. And even just walking through the Palais here for 2 hours, looking at all of the, the exhibition content, it's like this wonderful injection of creativity that I wish all of my team could get. So for me, it's just casting a very, very wide net and encouraging the rest of the team to do the same.
Interesting. Axel?
I think people do crazy, interesting things. And, we need to spend time for observation. And the one interesting thing is, with digital, data gives a very good entry point to discover new things and new trends. What's changing, what people want to watch, what are they interested in. Just to name a few, one of the things that has been a big game changer on UI has been GIFs. When you tell people who likes 30 seconds ad on Facebook, raise your hand. Not many hands. And who likes GIFs? And then and you say, well, if you ask a room, you see that. If you start looking at what people are doing, you also see that. And it not only changes, like the format or the way to play with the shots and the way to animate your story, it also changes your visuals. So, for instance, if you do lipstick, you can show lipstick on, like a color, like a Pantone, or you can show it on skin with swipes. And the guy who invented that is really smart. And now we start having a few girls in the office who came out with an ID. Now we are doing makeup for hair. and we're going to do swipes on her. And what changes is your visual environment. And I think the one thing that does work is the problem is not to act upon what you see, is to see what you see. And that is something that we do more and more with the agencies to make sure that we have a shared understanding of the really interesting people do and how we can turn it in a way which is really innovative and new and compelling. And really the work on ideation has become something which is driven by data and driven by the format. So you really need to work on what people are doing to come with something really new.
Fantastic. Listen, we've run out of time. You guys are an extraordinary panel for this topic, really. Appreciate your coming out. Like I said, our morning experiment in panels, which again, it's in a modern world, it's about capturing this and amplifying it and sharing it. So there will be plenty of that. And we'll make sure you approve whatever is sent out on your behalf. But and thank you all, those of you who've come up the tiny little elevator back there to join us up on the Jardin. And unless there's a burning question out there, somebody want time for one question. Otherwise, we'll break. Thank you so much.
Thank you.